Hi, welcome to Relish Books. Today I'm talking about another one of my all-time favorite literary pieces as a novel, and that is Mrs. Dalloway by Virginia Woolf. This book is challenging in some ways, but I think as far as the writing, it is one of the best, and I think this book is actually summed up so well by the blurb on the back. And I know that blurbs are always full of praise, and sometimes it's not always merited, but I think this one really is. And so I'm just going to read it because it's really short. It's by Michael Cunningham, who I think adapted um, a show that was based on the book. But this is what he says about it, and I think it's really good. Mrs. Dalloway was the first novel to split the atom. If the novel before Mrs. Dalloway aspired to immensities of scope and scale, to heroic journeys across vast landscapes, with Mrs. Dalloway Virginia Woolf insisted that it could also locate the enormous within the everyday, that a life of errands and party-giving was every bit as viable a subject as any life lived anywhere, and that should any human act in any novel seem unimportant, it has merely been inadequately observed. The novel as an art form has not been the same since. Mrs. Dalloway also contains some of the most beautiful, complex, incisive, and idiosyncratic sentences ever written in English, and that alone would be enough reason to read it. It is one of the most moving, revolutionary artworks of the 20th century. Um, and I think that sums it up really well, without describing too much what it's actually about. I think the foreword in this edition is also really good, but it's really good to only read forewords and introductions after you've already read the book. They're always at the start of a book, but they're usually put there after the book has been out for years. It's usually like an added thing. And while I love forewords and introductions because I love reading about books, almost as much as I love reading books, they usually kind of discuss the book and break everything down. And they'll usually discuss like certain pivotal scenes, certain important plot points. And so it's if you don't want spoilers, especially like with this one, it kind of discusses like all the main things in the book. If you don't want spoilers, always make sure to read the foreword after you've read the book. But this one by Maureen Howard, I think, is really, really good. So it's interesting. Mrs. Dalloway takes place, I think it's set in 1922, and it was published in 1925, which was the same year that The Great Gatsby was published, which I just talked about in my last video. And in some ways, the books are actually similar. They're both kind of studying a certain class of people and a certain way of life. Great Gatsby, of course, is set in America in the Jazz Age, and so it's neat, like having just talked about that, to now think about this book that is going on at the exact same kind of time period as that one, but in England. The book is set on a single June day in London. And that's another thing that is special about this book. It takes place over the span of a single day, although it has lots of references to past things. The characters are dwelling a lot on the past and kind of looking towards the future. So it's kind of a book that is thinking about death a lot, thinking about the meaning of life, thinking about getting old. But it does, in real time, it all takes place in one day. And I love what Michael Cunningham said about making every day important and like everyday life important. And I think it's interesting too that I tried to read Virginia Woolf's previous novel, The Voyage Out, which just is an interesting side note. Mrs. Dalloway is actually in that book, but as like a very side character. She kind of just appears as like a passenger on the ship as the main characters. So you see her and Mr. Dalloway. But as a fan of this book, because I read it first, that was actually kind of disappointing. Even though at first it was neat, you're like, oh, because I didn't know. I was like, oh, here are these characters. But then they were kind of disappointing in that book. And honestly, I don't usually leave books unfinished, but I have not finished The Voyage Out. It was incredibly tedious. And just felt like nothing was happening. It wasn't going anywhere, and it's taking place on a very large scale. Like, these people that are traveling, like sailing to all these distant places. You would think that it would be a much more interesting setting, but it's not. It's like these great voyages were really boring to me, and this single day in the life of this society lady is fascinating. So, I think, like you said, it's all just about how things are observed. Um, and anything, like every ordinary thing, can be great if the writer's great. It's also kind of interesting to think about how most kind of bad writers will write adventure stories, because I think, and they can like be okay because there's plenty of action. And we'll be like, oh, well, the writing's not great, but the story's good because it has all these elements of um, drama and action. And you think about a bad writer could never make ordinary things great like this. It takes a really great writer to make ordinary things great. And I just think that's really neat. Mrs. Dalloway also has a form that it was very new, and the same kind of with, again, another parallel with The Great Gatsby. She was very intentionally creating a new kind of novel. She was very intentionally making a masterpiece. Like, she knew that it was different. She knew that it was unique. She also, at this point in her career, was very confident in her writing skills, and she just had a lot of fun writing, and the joy in her writing is very clear in Mrs. Dalloway. And the style is, again, it's something that I've never really read before, even in her other works. The flow of it, it's all just there's no chapters. It's all just straight through, and it's just a constant stream of consciousness. And you have these little sentences here and there that are like these perfect short little sentences that kind of break up the flow and kind of gives you a little break and keep you grounded, because for the most of the book it's just this flow of thought that's just broken up by commas, and the sentences can be like a page long. It's pretty wild, but I really like it. It can be confusing because it is in the third person, and it's not always from Mrs. Dalloway's point of view. In fact, the book just shifts from person to person kind of as you encounter them. So, like, it starts with Mrs. Dalloway, and she walks to the street, and she's standing there, and you're kind of in her mind, you're seeing what she's seeing, and then suddenly you're in the mind of, like, the man passing her, and he sees her there, and he's thinking about that. And so the consciousness, just without any like introduction or setup, it just jumps from person to person. And so you have to like be paying attention to it, but it makes it really interesting. And it's like, it's fun because there'll be these people, the people that other characters are thinking about, and you get their thoughts on them, and then it'll eventually switch, and you'll get the thoughts of these other people about those people. There's so many things that I love about this book. I love Mrs. Dalloway herself. It's just these little images, again, like moments that I just remember, kind of like in The Great Gatsby. When I think of Mrs. Dalloway, I always think of flowers. partly because of the opening line. Again, Mrs. Dalloway said she would buy the flowers herself. I think is what it is, or order the flowers herself. It's just this statement that kind of opens the book, sets the whole stage, and then it's just clear how much she loves flowers. Flowers are a very important part because the whole novel is, the setting is her getting ready for this party, and that she's giving. And at one point in the book, her husband brings her flowers, and it's this really sweet moment when they're this older couple. They're very set in their ways. They're very interdependent. That's something that it talks about a lot. They have a very interdependent marriage. They're two very separate people, but they're happy also. And there's this part in the book where he realizes that her old suitor from India is coming home, and they're going to see him. And he kind of thinks about her. He starts thinking about his wife in a way that he hasn't for a long time. And he wants to tell her that he loves her. But it's like he can't do it in those words because there's this shyness between them, this barrier, because their relationship isn't like that. And so he brings her flowers, and it's just a really sweet scene, and the way that she builds the characters and the way that you see the relationships unfold is really neat. I love how I feel like if a different author had written this, if someone else had taken this same setting and the same cast of characters, it would have been all about, especially in the time period and just the people. I feel like another author would have taken it and had it be mostly about maybe an affair between Mrs. Dalloway and her old lover, because they spend so much of the book thinking about each other. They clearly still have feelings for each other, even though they are all these years later married to other people, and they still think about each other a lot. But what's interesting, again, I feel like other authors would have done this so differently, but the way that Virginia Woolf approaches this is so interesting. It's far more interesting than it would have been if they had had an affair, or even talked about having one, or were planning one, or something like that, or were tempted to have one, because they're really not. It's so interesting in that his coming back kind of, because Mrs. Dalloway's thinking, she's thinking all the time, like, how would it have been if I had married him instead? And so she's constantly wondering about this, imagining him being with her all the time, and his coming back and her contemplating her life. She has this moment where she kind of acknowledges that she's really happy with the choice that she made. Her husband, as a character, he seems sort of stiff and boring, but he's like, but they're happy. They're happy with the happiness of a steady, good life that they've built rather than a passionate relationship. And because they're not passionately in love, they're pretty distant. And it's just so different a perspective, because we might look at that and be like, well, that is not the marriage that I would want. But with who Mrs. Dalloway is, and how she is, and how she wants her independence, she really examines it and realizes that she has the marriage that she wants, and she's happier with Richard than she would have been with Peter. And it's just such a refreshing and different perspective than what you see a lot of the time in writing. And it's almost like it makes her such her own person, because even you reading it are like, you kind of feel like, oh, well, I wouldn't feel that way. I don't think that's the choice that I would have made. And that helps to establish her as her own person and give her very clearly her own character. and I really like that. The book kind of, I think instead of paralleling The Great Gatsby with its lifestyle and time period, it more contrasts with it. Because while The Great Gatsby, it feels like all these things in this time are ultimately meaningless and hollow, Mrs. Dalloway gives meaning to all the little things. And it really brings out that it's just in how she sees it, in how she approaches life and loves life, and just brings such an excitement to it. It's kind of hinted at, it's just mentioned multiple times through the book that she's had like this illness that she's recovered from, and so it's almost like she has this fresh appreciation for life. It's like she has all these struggles that she's thinking about, like possible regrets, sadnesses. It's it's in a post-war world, all these things, and yet ultimately she just loves her life so much and loves all the little things in her life so much. She loves just her social life and giving her parties. And it's interesting how she feels like it feels like her approach is right in so many ways. And then you get the perspectives of other characters who keep thinking about like her flaws and how they think she's wrong in all these areas. And it's just such a great study of character, and again in such a unique style. It is challenging. Like I said at the beginning, it you have to pay attention reading it. You can kind of get lost, and even like really loving the writing, sometimes I can feel my eyes kind of like wandering down the page and not um taking the time to really read all these great flowing sentences that just kind of move from like um, one likeness of something to the next. Um, but overall, it is so, so good. One of those books that it's nice that it's kind of short because you really take your time with it to just savor the language. Virginia Woolf is such a master of language, and she definitely knew it and used it um, and worked really hard on it. Um, it's funny. This is the I've only read this one, and I've tried to read a couple of her other things. This is the only one that I really like. I want to read more of her stuff, but she was so critical of so many other authors, and so it's interesting to read her writing and like wonder kind of like why she had these criticisms. She criticized very harshly like some of the biggest names of the time. She really didn't like James Joyce's Ulysses, which I haven't read, but I hear about everywhere. I know she criticized Jane Austen, though I think she did ultimately think she was a very good writer. Um, oh, lots of others. She was very critical. Definitely, she thought that things needed to be a certain way. She expected a certain standard from language. I think she said that James Joyce was showing off in his writing, which is kind of interesting because some people reading her writing might say the same of her. But I don't know, it's always interesting like to hear what authors think of each other. But I love the book. I would highly recommend it. Again, it's one of those ones that is fun to reread once in a while. Just for the writing, for the characters. Um, yeah, it's just a really great thought-provoking, deep book that's not about any kind of like intense things. It takes such ordinary things and is like, hey, these ordinary things are important, just as important as um, anything else that people write about, and I really love that. So that's what I think of Mrs. Dalloway.